And today, I of course will be giving the global overview of trade in fish, as well as market measures to reduce illicit fish trade. Okay, so which animal protein do you think is the most widely traded globally? Is it fish? Is it beef? Is it pork? Is it chicken? Speak up. Fish? Okay, I hear a lot of fish. Good job. That wasn't a trick question. So 49% of traded animal protein is aquatic food products, followed by a distant second with beef, 19%, pork 18%, poultry 11%. Anyone hazard a guess as to why? Why do we have such extensive trade in fish compared to other animal products or animal proteins? Yeah. Anything else? Any other guesses? Yeah, fishes are very important to communities. But what is it about fish that differentiates it from something like chicken? Sorry? Yeah, we don't have to raise it ourselves, so it's easier to fish, sure, easier to get. But, you know, if I go and buy chicken in the supermarket, do I just buy chicken? Do I buy European chicken or Fijian chicken? Or, I mean, are there different types of chicken, I should say? No. But are there different types of fish? Yes, exactly. So that was what Francis mentioned a few days ago now. He showed you all those different types of fish that he caught in one catch. And that really shows really the massive diversity when we talk about fish. And of course, no country is able to catch all of that fish by itself, and so there is significant trade. And so we say that fisheries have very long value chains because, first of all, they are traded a lot because, you know, we want different types of fish. But secondly, because a lot of the time what's happening with fish trade is that it's maybe caught in one place, transshipped somewhere else, processed in a third place, sold in a fourth place. So we see these massively long value chains, these big trade flows going all over the world. Now, if we look at the way the fish is flowing when we talk about trade in fish, we can see that here, this is the top 10 importing companies by aquatic products by value. Can everybody read that? No. Okay. So here we have the United States, China, Japan, Spain, France, Italy, Germany, Korea, Sweden, and the Netherlands. Top 10 importing countries of aquatic products by value. Do you notice anything about those countries? What are they? What types of countries are they? Yes, they are, but what else? Developed, exactly. Developed countries. High-income countries. On the other hand, top 10 exporting countries of aquatic products by value look quite different, apart from China, which is simultaneously one of the biggest importers and the biggest exporter of fish. But the others include more, so this is more of a mixture, so Norway, Vietnam, Chile, India, Thailand, Netherlands, Ecuador, Canada, and Russia. So we see a lot more developing countries in there, right? So essentially what we're seeing with global trade flows is fish often moving from developing countries, the developing world, to developed countries. Important to keep in mind as we go through this. Now, if we look at the economics of fishing, we talked about the economics of IUU fishing the other day, but if we just look at fishing as a whole, of course, when you're talking about industrial fishing, we're talking about a business. It's like any industry, you want to make profit. So it's an important motivator to make profit. But increasingly what we see is that fishing is less profitable because stocks are depleting, so vessels have to go further out, improve their ability to catch fish, of course, by maybe upgrading their gear, modernizing their boat. And they need to also stay at sea longer to make a profit. And so this state of affairs starts to incentivize problematic behaviors and unsustainable practices by both fishers and vessel owners and governments. So for example, as we talked about the other day, this can incentivize illegal fishing. And what I'm really going to be talking about during a lot of this presentation is illicit trade in fish. So this is the other side of the sort of illegal fishing coin. Of course, if we want to make a profit from illegal fishing, we have to be able to sell the fish. And there's a massive illicit trade in fish, or massive trade in IUU caught fish. So that is what a lot of this presentation will deal with. But there's other problematic behaviors, such as costs being cut on things like labor and safety, which of course we'll deal with a bit more next week. And as I said, this can also incentivize unsustainable practices by governments, such as the provision of what we call capacity enhancing fisheries subsidies. And that is an issue I will deal with right at the end of the presentation. Great, so let's start with illicit trade in fish. So what do we mean by this? So illicit trade in general, of course, involves things like, money, goods, or value gained from illegal and generally unethical activity, so the sale of those goods. When we're talking about illicit trade in fisheries, we're talking about trade involving money, goods, or value gained from illegal and unreported fishing by vessels catching fish for commercial purposes. You will notice that there's no unregulated fishing in there, because of the issues we've discussed around unregulated fishing, regarding the fact that it's really up to the government to deal with that problem and not the fishers. So how does illicit trade happen? In many of the same ways that IUU happens, so at sea transshipment. Export in large refrigerated containers is another way that illicit trade often happens, because these containers tend to be less inspected than fishing vessels. And also sale to less regulated local and regional markets. So during my group discussion yesterday, we were talking about how some locals will go out and trade the frozen tuna off the purse-seined vessels and sell it in local markets. Now, I'm not saying that is necessarily illegally caught, but that is an example of how that kind of fish can make it into local and regional markets and not have to go through all the stringent requirements of exporting to blocks like the EU or countries like the US, which have a lot of market measures in place to prevent this type of illicit fish trade. And this is a massive problem worldwide. So up to 14 million metric tons of unreported fish catches were traded illicitly each year. This is an estimation, of course. With an economic impact of between 26 and 50 billion US dollars annually. So that's a huge amount that's being lost in illicit fish trade. The largest economic and income impacts of this are from on the African and Asian regions, but this does tend to affect most developing regions. And again, the negative effects are fairly similar to the negative effects from IUU fishing, such as depletion of fish stocks, diversion of funds from the legitimate economy if you're not paying taxes and license fees, and of course the knock-on effects on food security, loss of jobs and income. So how do we go about preventing illicit fish trade using market mechanisms? So there's a number of ways. We've already discussed the issue of port state measures. Port state measures, of course, prevent illegally caught fish from entering the market at the port. There's trade sanctions, so something like those trade bans that are put on non-cooperating countries by the EU through its carding scheme, with those yellow and red cards that it gives out. You may have heard of that. We, of course, can ban harmful fishery subsidies, and I'll discuss more about how that affects IUU fishing at the end. We can look into practices like eco-labeling. So this is, of course, less of a government program and generally more of a program created by industry. But this, works on market laws of supply and demand. It gives consumers the choice whether they want to buy sustainably caught fish or not. And finally, we have transparency mechanisms like catch documentation schemes. And the intention of this is to track the fish from essentially the catch to the plate, and to make sure that, you know, the same fish that is originally caught is the same fish that ends up on the plate. So I'm not going to go over port state measures because we've already discussed that. So I'm going to jump straight into the issue of trade sanctions, talk about how they work, and actually whether these are legal in international law. So trade sanctions are essentially bans on trade with a country that seem to be engaging in IUU fishing or failing to control IUU fishing and related problems in its waters. And these trade bans are ostensibly used to protect markets from, you know, IUU caught fish entering them. But in practice, they do also have the effect of generally preventing illicit trade and IUU fishing. However, they are generally only effective if they are applied by large and powerful importers, such as the United States and the European Union. Anyone have any idea why that would be? Anyone want to guess? No takers. Okay, so let me give an example. So say country A is a big market state, a large and powerful importer. And country A, you know, imports its fish from all over the world. But there's two other countries I want to, you know, think about in this scenario. So country B exports 85% of its fish catch to country A. Country C only exports 5% of its fish catch to country A. If country A then puts a trade ban on country B and country C, what are those countries going to do? Country B is exporting 85%, country C only 5%. Do you think those countries are going to comply? Are they going to change, you know, are they going to deal with IUU fishing in their waters? Country B might, yes. Country B has a lot more to lose, right? Country C, maybe not. Maybe country C will just find another market. So you can see why, you know, it only works if you are importing significant amounts of fish from a country. From a purely economic perspective, that country is going to look at the cost-benefit analysis. They're going to say, okay, well, I can get a certain amount of money from exporting 5% of my fish, but maybe I'll spend a lot more trying to comply and, you know, deal with IUU fishing in my waters. So instead, I'm just going to, you know, spend my time looking for another market to send my fish to. So that's the basic premise behind it. And that's why, you know, if a country which isn't importing a lot of fish tries to put a trade ban, it's probably not going to have a significant effect. So the example I want to talk about is the European Union. Like I said, they have this, what they call a carding scheme. So if the EU decides that you're a non-cooperating country, you're not controlling fishing in your waters, they will issue a yellow card. Now, a yellow card is a warning, and it basically says you need to fix this, otherwise we are going to place a red card on you, which is the trade ban. The yellow card doesn't actually have any effect trade-wise. It's just a warning, but the red card, of course, lost it. The red card, of course, does have significant effects, because then you can't send any of your fish to that country that's placed the ban on you. The EU actually has a similar program for its RFMO partners. So there was this interesting case, I think about 10 years ago now, between the EU and the Faroe Islands. They were RFMO partners in the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Commission. And at some point, they were deciding on the quota for herring stocks. And, you know, the Faroe Islands was getting very upset because it felt like all the other partners were bullying it and you know, giving it a much lower quota than it wanted. And it was that's probably true, to be honest. It's a less powerful country than the other partners in there, like the EU, Russia, and others. And so it went away and it said, okay, I'm going to unilaterally set a quota that's 3 times what you've given me. Now, of course, you know, that compromises the sustainability of the stock. So the EU said, okay, no, we're going to put a ban on you unless you change this. So this was eventually settled, but the Faroe Islands did actually take the EU to the World Trade Organization's trade court before they settled it, and complained about this IUU regulation under which these cards are issued. Now, this is the map of sort of non-cooperating countries of the EU. So, for example, we have little red flags here to show the countries that are red carded, yellow flags to show the countries that have a warning, and green flags to show countries where they've had a warning but it's been lifted. Quite a few in the Pacific Islands, but all green flags, so good job. And I think that most of these cards were lifted over 10 years ago, about 10 years ago, over 10 years ago. And this is actually an interactive map, so I can't really play around with it now. I do sometimes do that during classes with my students, but if you are interested, you can go to this map, you can click on the flags, you can see when the cards were issued, when they were removed, and you can also see the reasons for the decisions. So, for example, Cameroon is one of the most recent countries to have got a red flag in 2023, and the reason that it got that red flag was that it was, registering vessels to its fishing register, which were fishing on the high seas, and it couldn't control them because it didn't have the capacity, so it wasn't able to exercise its flag state responsibilities correctly. And also it had specifically listed a vessel which had been found engaging in IUU fishing in the past, so that's why that red card got put on there. Oh, sorry, before I move on. Do you see anything about that map which you find interesting regarding which countries have got these cards and which ones have not? There is a country on there which is quite notorious for IUU fishing but doesn't have a flag on it. Anyone have any idea? Don't know if this is big enough. One that has a lot of vessels, a lot of distant water fishing. Yeah, there we go. China, yes. Good job. Thanks, Sarah. Okay. You guys know about the BRICS countries, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. We've now opened it up to a whole lot of other countries too. But of course, this is a large and powerful alliance of countries, of emerging economies. None of those countries, Brazil, South Africa, India, wherever that is there, sorry, it's Sri Lanka that has the flag there, not India. China and Russia, none of them have these flags, right? So does that tell you anything about the scheme, about what's going on here? These are powerful countries, but they're also big trading countries. They are not compliant, but they're not being called out for it, are they? They're not being given warnings or red cards or yellow cards. Yeah, so I think that's a little bit telling when it comes to the EU's carding scheme. So the scheme has had some successes, like the Republic of Korea got a card, I believe in 2012 or 2013. Dr. Han, when he comes next week, can tell you more about it. But you know, they updated their legislation, put in, you know, tracking mechanisms, tried to better control their fleets. I mean, of course, nothing is perfect, but they have, you know, done a lot to improve IUU fishing in their vessels. On the other hand, there are countries that have had multiple yellow cards, like Panama, like Ghana, so they've been relapses. And there's also been countries that have been red listed for nearly a decade, like Cambodia. So I think this scheme has had mixed results when it comes to preventing illicit fish trade. Primarily because even though the EU can come in and assist with legal reform if necessary, it can't obviously, assist with capacity constraints and enforcement constraints in the long run. There has to be political will to do that by the country and the region. And picking up on what I was talking about earlier, and I think, Francisco, you've also done this analysis, but there was an interesting analysis done of all the yellow and red cards that have been given under this EU carding scheme. And what was found is that the trade flows coming from the red carded countries are very low compared to the trade flows from the yellow carded countries. And so the perception with all of this is that firstly, the EU is not putting these cards on countries with which it has a lot of trade. Well, I guess that's the only point, that it's not putting these cards on countries with which it has a lot of trade. And also, when it yellow cards countries with which it has a lot of trade, these generally don't get upgraded to red cards. And all of this feeds into the potential legality of these trade bans. So without going into technical detail, the World Trade Organization has a trade court where one country can take another, and it actually has the ability to enforce its judgments, unlike many other international tribunals. And what WTO rules provide is that there needs to be fairness in the way you apply your trade policies. You have to apply it equally to different countries. Now, of course, putting a trade ban on a country is not giving equal treatment to all countries. You are singling out a particular country. But there is the possibility to have exceptions to this rule for public goods, like environmental protection and sustainability. However, those measures also have to be fair. And the way that the EU is applying the scheme, I don't think really meets that criteria. So it seems to be differentiating between countries, as we saw. It also seems to be differentiating between other countries and its own fishing fleet, which of course has also been caught engaging in IUU fishing on multiple occasions, particularly in West African waters. So, as I said before, the Faroe Islands did try and challenge these measures, but the case was settled. If they ever did get challenged at the WTO, I'm not sure they would be found to be compliant with WTO rules. So do with that what you will. Okay, so before we move on to traceability, does anyone have any questions on trade bans? No questions? No comments? Oh, Francisco has a comment, as suspected.
Now, just to be clear, and that is something that Saurara will touch in the afternoon, the most perhaps I would say hypocritical issue of the red cards is that it is applied to countries who do not, other than Cameroon, do not have sanitary access to the EU. So the trade is, so the Sri Lanka and Cameroon were the two countries who were exporting, were authorized to export it to the European Union, and got red carded, but they did not have access. All the rest never exported to the EU because they never had access to the EU. So it is one point of hypocrisy. And the second one is that while we had all these things, if you go back to the map, none of the Latin American countries at the time when we got in the region the yellow cards was red carded, and this is one of the areas where the European fleet has less presence. On top of that, the developed countries who got it, particularly Korea and the Philippines, went out much faster than the Pacific Island countries. And by fact, the Philippines got a lot of the systems from Papua New Guinea that they use, because we developed it from Papua New Guinea and then we saw it coming back in the Philippines. So it's not a happy story, that one from the yellow cards in the region, just saying. A lot of this white hair come from those days. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much for adding to that. That was really interesting. Okay, yes.
Just a question. I wanted. I know you said that they haven't been challenged at the WTO, but has it ever come up within the WCPFC, or do they ever get called out? Do they ever get called out anywhere else? At WCPFC, is there any other pressure on the EU about their carding system, or like just because it hasn't been challenged at the WTO, are there any other places where they get not shamed, but but does it ever get brought up anywhere else?
So I think maybe Francisco can talk to the WCPFC or one of the WCPFC representatives. So, because I'm not sure about that, obviously. But, you know, I think in general, another reason why they're not putting these cards on powerful countries is that they do know that as soon as that happens, they will be dragged to the WTO because those countries have resources. You know, part of the sort of strategy in giving these cards to countries with less resources is that, you know, WTO cases are very expensive to litigate, and so they'll be much less likely to actually take them there and probably more likely to try and settle. But yeah, no, to be honest, I haven't seen it really called out anywhere else. I've seen academic writing saying it's a model of WTO compliance, but I do strongly disagree with that. So I don't know, does Francisco or anyone have any you know, insight onto maybe RFMO processes regarding this? No? Okay.
There's been quite a lot of talk about the WTO process, but the key issue is the cost. And two, on the other side of the equation, the EU has put a lot of money on strengthening the systems for all of those countries who were yellow carded. All of the work we did here in the Pacific during the yellow card time was paid by the EU via FFA. So there is a very an incentive to, you know, to bite the hands that on the other side is feeding you. So it's a geopolitical game, absolutely. So, and in fact, what happens is that a lot of the Pacific Islands who got those yellow cards got a big part of the reason was that they had signed many of the international agreements that she explained a few days ago, and we've explained days ago, but this normally are signed by the initiative of foreign affairs without fisheries being involved. So then they go, you signed this and you're not doing it. So that was the reason for the yellow cards, you know. But yeah, it's thankfully it's gone, and hopefully we never see them again. However, yeah, some countries in the region, like Panama got a second yellow card, and allegedly Vanuatu is on the same line.
Great, thanks, and thanks for the question. I think one important point to make is that, I mean, it's not all bad, you know. Of course, if you get a yellow card, the EU does come in and at least try and help with some legal reforms. So, I mean, it's not, you know, entirely devoid of benefit. It's just that, you know, there is sort of this geopolitical unfairness to it. Okay, so let's move on to traceability, and this includes measures like eco-labeling and catch documentation schemes. I'm not going to talk too much about eco-labeling because Francis will be doing a whole presentation on certification after this. But, you know, just to explain the basic concept from a sort of trade and market point of view. Eco-labeling, you know, essentially it gives consumers a choice to buy sustainably caught fish. And it works on these market laws of supply and demand. So if consumers want sustainable fish, then of course suppliers will provide it. However, this demand for sustainably caught fish, this demand for eco-labels is often quite concentrated in developed countries or high-income countries. We can see there an example from Sweden. This is the torsk, the codfish. And I don't know if you can see, but it has 3 different eco-labels on it there. The Marine Stewardship Council, the Krav eco-label, and also this Norwegian eco-label, which I can't pronounce. So you know, not only do the Swedes love fish, but they also love it to be sustainable. So, you know, this is sort of multiple eco-labels on this fish here. But this demand in developed countries, of course, affects developing country suppliers, because as we saw, the trade flows are generally going from the developing to the developed world. And so, in theory, these eco-labels can provide economic benefits for fisheries, for developing country fisheries, for being sustainable, such as, you know, giving access to overseas markets, higher prices, and potentially more demand. I say in theory because a lot of the time what we found is that these benefits don't necessarily trickle down to the fishers. And when you, again, weighing up those sort of benefits, if you're not getting significant benefits from it, and you will have to incur significant costs to comply with the standards set by these eco-labels, you know, you may think twice about wanting to ensure that your fishery is compliant, and this is particularly the case for small-scale fisheries. You know, most of the certified fisheries are these big offshore fisheries. Another issue is that this large market demand for sustainable fish can lead to practices like greenwashing, and in which case, you know, if there's a lot of problems here, then the government may need to step in and set guidelines like they have in the United States. But I'll leave the rest of this discussion to Francis. And I'm going to focus specifically on catch documentation schemes. Has anyone had to deal with catch documentation schemes in their work, deal with compliance for the EU? Or the US? They also have a catch documentation scheme. Yeah? Anyone? Okay. Yes, Lauren. Okay, so you know all about this. But essentially what catch documentation schemes do, well, the intention anyway, is to track fish from sort of catch to plate, from fishing grounds to market. And of course they're designed to prevent IEU fish entering markets, as well as being supplemented with uncertified products throughout the supply chain. And the way this works is that, you know, various, you know, documents and certificates have to be provided at each point in the supply chain to ensure, first of all, that the fish is sustainably caught, and secondly, that, you know, the fish that was originally caught, that's represented on the catch certificate, is the same fish which is, you know, ending up in the market essentially at the end of the day. Now, this is a kind of simplistic diagram of a catch documentation scheme. And this yellow line here is representing the catch documentation scheme, whereas this orange dotted line represents the actual path that the fish is taking. So under the catch documentation scheme, what needs to be provided for this little green fish here, this green fish is subject to the catch documentation scheme, this little red fish is not. So what needs to be provided for this little green fish when it's caught is a catch certificate, which will allow, you know, the official at the port when it's landed to verify that this fish was caught sustainably and legally. So you need to provide all this information on the catch certificate, including things like where the fish was caught, which vessel it was caught by, you know, what type of fish it is, all of this information that officials might need. And then when the fish is landed, this information is verified. After that, generally, with most catch documentation schemes, they will only require verification that this is this fish that's, you know, being exported or imported is the same fish that's been caught. They will only generally require this verification at the point of export or import. But here we have this fish going for processing, but the catch documentation scheme in this case is not requiring any information at this point. So what can potentially happen at this point in the processing, in the process of processing fish? Substitution, yeah, excellent, yeah, substitution. So this green fish can be substituted for the red fish, for example, Or, you know, the green fish can be supplemented with the red fish because, of course, when we process fish, it often reduces in weight and size. So these are the dangers that can happen within a country. So how does the catch documentation scheme actually prevent that happening? Catch documentation scheme only requires that you provide information at the point of export. So is this catch documentation scheme effective or not? Yes. Yes. Why do you say that, Lorian? You're saying it's effective, why? Sure. So at the point of export, the official who is verifying that, you know, this fish is the same fish that, you know, is represented on the catch certificate, they have to be able to say that for sure, right? They have to be able to say this is the same fish. And so the catch documentation scheme may not require that you provide information at the point of processing, but at export, the official needs to know that during the processing stage, this fish was not substituted. So what this essentially means is that even though the catch documentation scheme doesn't require this information, inherent in this idea of the catch documentation scheme is that there are robust national traceability processes in place so that this official can say for sure that this is the green fish and not the red fish. Right? So that maybe is a little bit more resource intensive, but that is required when you implement a catch documentation scheme, and the consequences of not doing that can be quite severe. For example, the EU, one of the potential basis on which a yellow card and a red card can be issued is that, you know, you're not properly complying with the catch documentation schemes that they have in place. Okay, I'm not going to go over this, it's a little bit technical. So there are different types of catch documentation schemes. So there's the ones implemented by RFMOs, which include things like the trade-based catch documentation schemes, which ensure traceability in international markets. So, you know, part of the problem with that one is that you can't track the extent of IUU caught fish for stock estimate purposes because you don't know what's going on in domestic markets. And so RFMOs will also have a few high-value species that they track in both domestic and international markets, the fisheries-based catch documentation schemes. But these are, of course, very resource-intensive if you're tracking the fish throughout the entire value chain. And so, you know, these are only really going to be created for a few different high-value species. And then we have these market-based catch documentation schemes, which are very comprehensive. They'll often cover all the species going into a particular market. But again, they only protect that market, so, you know, IUU caught fish can always be pushed into other markets. So just so you know, there's different types of catch documentation schemes, some of which are more effective at preventing illicit fish trade than others. And if anyone is interested and wants to know more, or, you know, wants to better understand the processes of catch documentation schemes, the FAO has got the soft law instrument, the voluntary guidelines for catch documentation schemes, which provides sort of minimum standards that should be adhered to, and also this technical guideline, which is quite useful for national authorities to understand their role in implementing the catch documentation schemes. Any questions on catch documentation schemes? Yes.
On my last presentation, if you're still around, is about the challenges of setting up CDSs in the Pacific. So a lot of these things will be really a bit deeper, but those two resources that she presented are pretty much the basis of what we started doing in 2000 or something.
Okay, good. So you can go deeper into these more technical aspects, which I don't have time for. No, I got to skip over that. It's okay. All right, so finally I'm going to talk about harmful fishery subsidies. Now, fishery subsidies came up a lot yesterday in my group as, you know, potential ways to improve social and developmental outcomes in the small-scale sector. And so I'm quite excited to talk about this and to show both the benefits and the drawbacks of certain subsidies. So let's start at the beginning. What is a subsidy? This is something that a lot of people, I don't want to say get wrong, but it's more just like this perception is that fishery subsidies are things like fishing inputs, like fuel subsidies, or you know, for gear or for boat, you know, building or modernization. But actually subsidies can be a lot broader than that. So a subsidy is essentially a financial contribution, which can be a direct payment, a loan, a tax break, you know, any sort of financial contribution. It has by a government or public body. It has to be given by a government. If it's given by a private company, it's not a subsidy. It has to confer a benefit, which essentially just means it needs to have a market value. And it needs to be specific to an industry or region. So in this case, of course, we're dealing with the fisheries industry. So here are some examples of fisheries subsidies. I hope you can all read that. So at the top there, we have the ones that we might expect: vessel construction, modernization, fishing inputs. Anything that jumps out at you is a bit strange that you didn't know could be a fishery subsidy there? Fisheries management, yeah. Anything else? Sorry? Yeah, exactly. So these types of what we call beneficial subsidies are not always seen as subsidies, but actually if we look at that definition, it's a pretty neutral definition. And you know, these types of payments to the fishing industry, provided they are payments which are benefiting the industry, can be considered as fishery subsidies. And because we have this potential wide range of payments to the fishing industry that could fall under the definition of a subsidy, there have been attempts in the literature to classify subsidies into different categories, well, fishery subsidies, I should say, essentially depending on their benefits and drawbacks for sustainability of fish stocks. So, for example, good subsidies or beneficial subsidies, things like fisheries management, stock assessment, etc. Bad or capacity enhancing subsidies. This is a very simplistic kind of representation, of course, so, you know, don't come at me and say, okay, well, you know, some of these subsidies we use to improve you know, our fisheries management in some way or another. This is just a sort of simplistic representation of subsidies that generally will have detrimental effects on sustainability of fish stocks. Those are the things like fishing inputs and so on, those ones that we would generally classify as subsidies. And then we have these strange category called ambiguous subsidies, which are essentially subsidies that could be good or bad, or could be beneficial or capacity enhancing, depending on how the subsidy program is structured. One thing about this categorization, apart from being a bit simplistic, is that of course it relies on the effects of the subsidy on sustainability of fish stocks, so the environmental benefits. It doesn't really consider social issues like safety at sea, improvements in labor conditions, that's kind of social protection measures. Those types of subsidies can actually fall under capacity enhancing subsidies because, for example, if I want to improve safety on board and I give some sort of safety equipment, that could be seen as giving gear, or I want to improve the safety of a vessel by modernizing it, again, that can be seen as capacity enhancing subsidies. So one of the big drawbacks of this classification, of course, is that it really focuses primarily on environmental issues and not on social issues. Now, just some facts and statistics about fishery subsidies to give you an idea of how big an issue this actually is. The latest estimates of fishery subsidies put these at around 35 billion US dollars annually. Huge amounts of money and huge amounts of support being given to the fishing industry, right? And the majority of these subsidies are capacity enhancing, most of which are spent on fuel, particularly because of the distant water fishing that these subsidies are supporting. To give you an idea of subsidies by region, I'm sure you can't read this, I can barely read this. So over here we have Asia, so subsidies given by the Asian region. This is China. It's got its own category because it's, you know, by far the world's biggest subsidizer. Thank you. Yep, we have Europe over here, also a huge subsidizer. North America, although North America is giving more beneficial subsidies than capacity enhancing subsidies. And then on the other end of the spectrum, of course, we have Africa, South Central America, and the Caribbean, and right at the bottom here, Oceania. So you guys are not giving a lot of fishery subsidies. And mostly they are beneficial, so that's good. But you can see, of course, that there is massive global inequality here and massive unfair competition, right? The fleets in these countries are just not going to be able to compete with the fleets in these countries because they're just not getting the same amount of support. And we see the same thing sectorally. So the small scale sector over here is getting significantly less in subsidies than the large scale sector, again causing massive unfair competition. So why are these subsidies a problem? We've discussed it a little bit. Does anyone want to hazard a guess? I've mentioned some of them already. The issue we just talked about, unfair competition. Okay, so the main issue with fishery subsidies, as I mentioned a couple of days ago in the drivers of IEU fishing, is that they can lead to overfishing and overcapacity. Of course, if you are continually building boats, if you're continually supporting those boats with input subsidies, you artificially lower the cost of fishing, which means that even as stocks deplete, fisheries remain profitable. And so, you know, these fishes are not leaving the industry when normally the depleting fish stocks and the reducing profits would cause them to leave the industry. And so we have overcapacity, and that leads to overfishing with just too many boats chasing too few fish. They can also create and subsidize IEU fishing, as we discussed the other day. And as we also discussed the other day, they create and subsidize these very large distant water fleets, which are also notorious for overfishing and IEU fishing, particularly in the waters of developing countries. They create the unfair competition we saw in those graphs. They distort markets. They artificially lower the price of fish, right? So it's difficult to compete. They are very difficult to undo. Again, as I mentioned the other day, politicians don't want to be unpopular. They don't want to withdraw subsidies from the industry once they've got them and once the industry is reliant on them. And of course, all of this can affect food security and livelihoods. However, one thing I want to draw attention to is the absolute versus relative impacts of subsidies. So there's always this perception that we need to deal with the largest subsidizers, and that is true. But subsidies can also have significant effects at local level, even if they're given by smaller subsidizers. If we look at subsidies given relative to the proportion of catch that is actually landed, we see quite a different graph here. We actually see Oceania right at the top there because you actually just have less fisheries. And so the subsidies that you are giving as a proportion of landed catch is actually higher than somewhere like Asia. However, you know, it's mostly beneficial subsidies, so it's okay. But as we can see that this graph becomes a lot flatter, right, if we look at this. And what this essentially means in practice is that even these smaller subsidizers, even if you're just giving small subsidies, this can cause significant negative environmental and socioeconomic effects in your local fisheries. And a very good example is that one we mentioned the other day, those big canoe fleets in places like Ghana, also places like Senegal. These are, small-scale fishers that have been massively subsidized. The subsidies have allowed them to build bigger boats, to get outboard motors, they continue to provide premix fuel to these subsidies, to these fisheries. And so what happens is that these fisheries have now massively decimated the small pelagic stocks on which they rely and on which the coastal communities rely. And so this is the danger of fishery subsidies, even when they are given in smaller amounts, to smaller fisheries. Now, at international level, there's been some attempts to regulate subsidies, and this is really an issue that has to be regulated at international level, because as we saw, if you unilaterally reduce your subsidies, you put your fleets at a competitive disadvantage. And so what you really need to be doing is to have multilateral negotiations so everybody's reducing their subsidies simultaneously. Otherwise, it's very unlikely that any particular country is going to make the decision to do that. And SDG 14.6 specifically states that by 2020, states should negotiate an agreement to prohibit certain forms of fishery subsidies. Now, this SDG was created in part because the World Trade Organization has been negotiating an agreement on fishery subsidies since 2001. So you can see, it's been 23 years now. So you can kind of understand the difficulty of reaching a negotiated agreement on this issue, how sort of entrenched these subsidies are in fishing fleets, and how important this issue is to states. However, in 2022, the WTO did manage to adopt an agreement. It isn't a full agreement. What they basically did was that they said, we will adopt an agreement based on the things that we can agree on, and we'll leave the more contentious issues for negotiation at a later stage. So right now, what we have from the WTO is a partial agreement on fishery subsidies. Included in this agreement are some specific bans on specific types of subsidies. So, for example, this agreement bans subsidies that are going to IUU fishing. So these are vessels that have specifically been found to be engaging in IUU fishing. Countries can't provide subsidies to these vessels. It also has a ban on subsidies to fisheries that are targeting overfished stocks. And finally, it has a ban on subsidies to fishing in unregulated high seas areas. It's a bit unclear what that means. There's not much of the high seas which is unregulated at this point if we consider the coverage of RFMOs. But we're not sure if it's just going to be those very specific areas that aren't covered by an RFMO, or if it's actually going to be a bit broader than that. So for example, if you have a tuna RFMO that's only managing tuna, then if you're targeting other stocks in the area, perhaps those wouldn't be considered to be regulated, but we don't know yet. And then some of the additional provisions which are quite important are that there are technical assistance provisions for implementation of the agreement in developing countries. And these technical assistance provisions are quite robust actually compared to other WTO agreements. And they've set up this fisheries funding mechanism, which is a voluntary fund in which WTO members can make contributions to help developing countries implement this agreement. And another important issue I want to draw attention to is that there's an exemption for subsidies that are provided to rebuild fisheries after a natural disaster. So those are the provisions that they've already agreed on. The ones that they're still negotiating are the more contentious provisions. So those previous bans regulated behavior of vessels. This ban, if it is adopted, will ban specific types of subsidies. contributing to overcapacity and overfishing. So to give you an example, at the moment, under the current agreement, if I wanted to provide, say, a fuel subsidy to a fishing vessel, I only have to make sure that that subsidy, that vessel is not engaging in IUU fishing, it's not fishing overfished stocks, and it's not fishing in unregulated high seas areas. And this is a fairly easy standard to meet, considering that these bans are pretty narrow and they're actually further circumscribed by certain exemptions. So for example, under the ban on overfished stocks, you can continue to provide subsidies to overfished stocks, provided that you have management measures in place. So, you know, that kind of undercuts that ban a little bit. But under this article, I wouldn't be able to provide that fuel subsidy at all. It would just be banned completely. And so, of course, that's a much harder sell for countries, and it's going to be very difficult for agreements to be reached on that. And so, you know, they have a whole bunch of proposed exemptions, which unfortunately does undermine that ban quite a bit. But, for example, countries can continue to provide these subsidies if they have management systems in place. And then there are also exemptions for developing countries. So developing countries at the moment, what's being proposed is if a country is contributing less than 0.8% of annual marine capture production, then it's completely exempt. And also least developed countries are completely exempt, and other countries have a time limit on their exemptions. There's also an exemption for low income resource poor and livelihood fishing, which is essentially small scale fishing. And what's also being proposed, which I think is quite interesting, especially for you guys, is that essentially after 5 years, if it's found that this agreement is not actually contributing to the reduction of fishery subsidies, then the Fishery Subsidies Committee that they've just created can make specific recommendations regarding specific targets for specific reduction targets for distant water fishing nations and also for the largest subsidizers. And they need to take into account specifically the economic effects on small island developing states as well as least developed countries. However, as I mentioned in the classification section that we discussed earlier when we were thinking about the classification of subsidies and how, you know, things like safety, social protection are very much not taken into account in that classification. Similarly, we don't see a lot of social exemptions under this agreement, so exemptions for safety subsidies, exemptions for labor or working condition subsidies to improve working conditions, and so on. We only have that exemption for natural disasters, and that doesn't even include things like economic disasters, like, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic had severe effects on fisheries, considering how much trade goes on in fisheries and considering that trade was mostly stopped. So, so this agreement unfortunately just does not really deal very much with those social protection issues, and that is a serious shortcoming. So that's it. It was quite a long presentation, I know, but we were covering a bunch of different topics, and I really hope that it was interesting. I'm happy to take questions on the subsidy issue if we have some time. But otherwise, we can move on. But thank you so much.